Please welcome Sikivu Hutchinson.
Good evening. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Really poor children in really poor neighborhoods have no habits of working and have nobody around them who works, so they have no habit of showing up on Monday. They have no habit of staying all day. They have no habit of I do this and you give me cash unless it is illegal. Thus spoke Newt Gingrich, the spiritual guru of Christian Fascism Americana. And Gingrich's stagecraft, as many of you remember, set the tone for the GOP presidential campaign propaganda of the 1%, and of course was echoed by Mitt Romney shortly after Barack Obama won re-election. And Mitt Romney blasted Barack Obama for being a sugar daddy to women, minorities, and young people who voted for him in exchange for special gifts. So when I mentioned Gingrich's comment to a group of predominantly African American and Latino teachers during a faculty training that I was conducting, it was pretty clear to them that the really poor children that Gingrich was referring to were not Spanky and Alfalfa from the Little Rascals, or white Appalachian children, or even Honey Boo Boo from the hit reality TV show of the same name. And I know that there are a lot of closet Honey Boo Boo fans out there. Please feel free to reveal yourselves now. These were not the really poor children that Gingrich was exhorting to work as unpaid janitors in under-resourced inner-city schools, and the really poor neighborhoods that were allegedly rife with illegal activity were not, of course, the trailer parks and the Bruce Springsteen, blue-collar, salt-of-the-earth suburbs where presumably most white welfare recipients live. When mainstream America thinks poor, it thinks black. Let's break it down. It thinks ghetto, to use a term that my students trot out far too frequently, which translates into shiftless, looking for a handout, on welfare, dysfunctional, pathological, not subscribing to the so-called bootstraps ethos of rugged individualism, personal responsibility, and free enterprise, and typically en route to jail. And so the word poor was more or less excised from the political vocabulary during this campaign season. It was sucked up into the vacuum. Did not pass the lips of Barack Obama, much less Mitt Romney. And this is part and parcel of the fact that the staggering wealth gap that exists between blacks, Latinos, and whites has gotten more egregious, has been sucked up into this grand narrative of American exceptionalism. And so the social construction of the black and brown other has always been a critical linchpin of white Christian nationalist solidarity. The Tea Party and white evangelicals speak with the same voice. This has been confirmed by poll after poll after poll. And though dealt a resounding blow by Barack Obama's re-election, those that would rush to write the political obituary of this powerful constituency are far too premature. Because if we consider the majority of those who have submitted petitions to secede from the United States, they're coming from the lap of the old Confederacy, transmogrified into the new Confederacy, a la the Bible Belt. And so in 2007, the writer Chris Hedges wrote a landmark book called American Fascism, that some of you may be familiar with. And in the book, he defined Christian fascism as the Christian fundamentalist desire to see every aspect, every nook and cranny of government public policy informed by Old Testament principles. And so this sentiment emerges from, of course, political and economic turbulence, the decline of the middle class, deepening unemployment, and of course, economic recession. And he says that this dominionist backlash was driven by, quote, stories of failure, personal, communal, and often economic. Despair that would empower dangerous dreamers, those who today bombard the airways with an idealistic and religious utopianism that promises, through violent apocalyptic purification, to eradicate the old sinful world that has failed many Americans. So last year, this violent apocalyptic purification, i.e. the rapture, was packaged by the sham California fundamentalist entrepreneur Harold Camping as May 21st, 2011, Judgment Day. And this is incidental to the Camping empire. This is just a personal favorite of mine, The Rapture, starring Mimi Rogers. But Camping's empire was famously successful. I flew into Nashville, Tennessee, and then on to Mobile, Alabama, and the billboards were plastered all over the place. These mobiles, were roaming the city, trying to scoop up converts. And many of us non-believers, of course, woke up May 22nd and wonder why Michelle Bachmann and Focus on the Family and Tony Perkins and Rick Santorum and all the other Christian fascist gulag folk were still around. But when taken as the performance art of white nationalist identity, millennialist Christianity thrives on these so-called Red Sea parting plays, like the re-election of a black president and the ascent of gay marriage and so-called feminazis storming the barricades demanding abortion on demand and free birth control, all set against the Orwellian backdrop of big government jackbooting its way into the everyday, average, ordinary lives of hard-working, salt-of-the-earth white American citizens. So it really wasn't clear how many people of color were feeling Camping's Judgment Day, but what has been abundantly clear is that evangelicals of color do not, by and large, subscribe to the Christian fascist, anti-government, anti-social welfare, anti-science agenda. And decades after the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965, we've seen the Bible Belt rise up in this spasm of undocumented immigrant hysteria, passing all these fascistic laws, criminalizing undocumented immigrants, their families, and young people. And this is supposedly in an era in which the mainstream media trumpeted a new dawn of post-racialism and colorblindness, and cited in part the rise in all these kumbaya multiracial relationships and the creation of multiracial census categories, and this delusion that somehow millennials, young people between the ages of 16 and 30, did not believe themselves to have a racial identity. But this has been discredited by Colorline's Applied Research Center, which attests that millennials do indeed believe that race is still significant, that it has not magically receded in the age of Obama. In fact, cite mass incarceration and employment discrimination as being major factors in their lives and socioeconomic opportunities. And so, when thinking about cultural shifts, secularists are very proud to crow about the increase in the numbers of Americans that identify now as nuns and non-believers. But there has not been a significant increase in the numbers of people of color, particularly women of color, that identify as non-believers. African American and Latino women are amongst the most religious groups in the nation. African American and Latino women are not coincidentally the lowest paid, have the highest rates of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And contrary to the widespread stereotype and propaganda of the shiftless, looking for a handout, on welfare with 10 babies, African American woman, black women represent the highest workforce representation amongst all American women. And so a few years ago, the U.S. 2010 survey issued a groundbreaking report called Separate and Unequal: Blacks, Asians, Hispanics, and the Neighborhood Gap, which concluded, surprise, surprise, that African American and Latino affluent homeowners are concentrated in predominantly lower income and poorer neighborhoods relative to white working class people. And certainly these disparities emerge from wage discrimination based on race, but they also have been systematically institutionalized by policies and practices put into place by behemoths like Bank of America, Countrywide, and Wells Fargo that specifically targeted African American and Latino home buyers for predatory and subprime loans. Loans that, of course, would balloon up into double-digit loans that would then cause disproportionate foreclosure and blight in so-called inner-city and working-class suburban communities. And so even when affluent African-American home owners are able to gain some access into the white suburban version of the American dream, they may be victimized by hate crime and harassment and discrimination, a la a very celebrated case that happened to an African-American family of law enforcement officers, of all things, when they moved into Tony's suburban, predominantly white Yorba Linda, California, and were run out after being victimized by hate crime. And so, as these demographic shifts become more profound, as the wage gaps increase, as the wealth gaps increase, whites have 13 times the wealth, by the way, of African Americans and Latinos. And as the political capital of people of color increases, the writing is on the wall for the so-called secularist movement, that racial, economic, gender, and social justice must become the linchpin of secularist organizing. Now, several years ago, the GOP embarked upon a particularly insidious campaign against the Obama administration, smearing the Obama administration as a quote-unquote architect of a war against Christians. And this war against Christians propaganda was emanating primarily from shining intellectuals like the governor of this fair state, Rick Perry, and his Tweedledee Rick Santorum, and Tweedledum Bill O'Reilly. But what it really underscored is the fact that the Obama administration's assiduous attempts to court evangelicals, to go to all of these prayer breakfasts, to cite scripture at every turn, to be the good Christian administration, ultimately fails because white evangelicals have always been hell-bent on portraying him as the spawn of Karl Marx, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, and Satan. And so, historically, Christianity has never, ever been able to immunize the black other from racist demonization, because centuries later, Thomas Jefferson's caveat about the so-called unbridgeable moral and intellectual gap between blacks and whites still reverberates. And if you are to understand the role that religion plays in politics, you have to understand the role that race has played in shaping American religiosity, particularly when it comes to the strange arc of the law of hypodescent, in our terms as Americans, the one-drop rule. And the one-drop rule simply means that anyone with any known African ancestry is conferred with black, i.e. lower caste status. And so, looking back at early colonial law, it presented the white ruling class with a quandary because it prohibited the enslavement of Christians. And so, if you had all of these so-called black heathens running around, convening prayer meetings, gathering Bibles, wearing crosses, aping the white man, quote unquote, then by definition their enslavement would be unlawful. And so what were good, white, moral, upstanding Christians to do? Well, they moved the goalpost. So in 1639, it was decreed that baptism as a Christian would not free a slave. Blacks, after all, were the accursed children of Ham. They were to look to redemption and salvation via Massa in the afterlife, and not really give a damn about being under the yoke of white supremacist brutalization, domination, and terrorism in the here and now. 17th century Virginia law threw down the gauntlet even more and said that the status of a child would be determined by the condition of his or her mother, which meant that only black women, not white freed women, not white indentured servant women, could produce new slaves. So this essentially institutionalized slavery on the backs and in the wombs of black women, and established the category of the slave and the category of the black as synonymous, just as the categories of Christian, white, and free became synonymous. It drew a line in the sand between the black other and the white giddy multitude, or the white working class. It essentially was a vehicle to invent whiteness. And thus, although the one-drop rule was formalized in response to Jim Crow in the 20th century, the requirement that children be legally classified through the condition of the mother effectively imposed a one-drop rule on the social construction of race and enslavement in the colonies. This edict absolved white men with black offspring of their legal responsibilities as fathers. The black offspring of white fathers were by definition ineligible to lay claim to property or inheritance rights. More slaves, of course, meant a more robust plantation economy and greater concentration of wealth in white hands. And so under Virginia law, if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. Meaning that white, again, was synonymous with Christian. Didn't matter if you were Thomas Jefferson and you were a, quote, deist, or you were an animist, or you were some other category of religious belief. If you were a white person, you were de facto Christian, which meant moral, which meant upstanding, which meant human, which meant vested, which meant citizen. So at a talk I gave in Tucson, a white man approached me and asked if African Americans self-identified with the one-drop rule. And so when I pondered the fabulosity of that question, I thought about the fact that no other nation on the planet has conferred people of African ancestry with one-drop status, with lower caste status. The one-drop rule has never been imposed on Asians, Native Americans, or Latinos. And some of you may be aware that in 2000 and in 2010, the U.S. Census was revised to allow mixed-race individuals to identify more than one category. And this would seem to possibly mitigate the historical impact of the one-drop rule, but surprise, surprise, according to Harvard University researchers James Sedanius and Arnold Ho, 1/4 Asian individuals are consistently considered more white than are individuals with 1/4 African ancestry. And this despite the fact that African Americans and European Americans share a considerable degree of genetic heritage. And so Christian religious dogma has always been deployed to buttress this regime of the one-drop rule, in accord with the regime of anti-miscegenation or anti-race mixing. And shortly after the Supreme Court rendered its landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, which desegregated public schools and public facilities, the sage white supremacist Circuit Court Justice Thomas Brady said that white Southerners have every right to expect that their blood would remain pure and uncontaminated by the Negro. Because after all, this was a God-given, God-ordained right. And so writing in their book, Religious America, Secular Europe, the authors underscore this contradiction. The contradiction of America's vaunted modernity on the one hand, and its feverish hyper-religiosity on the other hand. And the fact that the U.S. has always swaggered brutally on the global stage, presenting itself as a beacon of science, rationalism, modernity, and secularism, and demonizing the third world as a cesspit of religious fundamentalist zealotry, while it itself is overrun with religious fundamentalist zealots in public policy. And so Hollywood always offers interesting insight into this dialectic of white religiosity and white rationalism via the backdrop of the supernatural, superstitious black other. And one of my favorite films in this regard is the 1997 movie The Apostle, which stars Robert Duvall as a Southern Pentecostal preacher on the lam for murder. And he plops down in a small Louisiana backwoods town, founds a church, whose backbone swiftly becomes African-American elderly women. And so in one pivotal scene, he's confronted by Billy Bob Thornton, playing a redneck from Central Casting, as he is wont to do. And in this particular scene, Billy Bob threatens to bulldoze the church because Duvall is, quote-unquote, consorting with niggers. And so Duvall is able to not only subdue Billy Bob with his come-to-Jesus magnetism, but he's also able to reduce him to this quivering mass of prayer. And the scene concludes with the two of them kneeling before the King James Bible. And there's a nice interlude where an older African-American woman is soulfully and spiritually incanting. And cinematically, this figure of the God-fearing, eyes cast heavenward black woman is always quite serviceable in terms of bringing the white hero, redeemed sinner, into clear focus. White moral authority, white heroism, white leadership, white rationality always achieves special reinforcement and resonance when set against the backdrop of the superstitious, supernatural, spiritual black other. And this is one of the reasons why Camping's Judgment Day 2011 was marketed strategically to communities of color. Now, secularists are often in this position of bemoaning the lack of solidarity and the lack of mass community amongst non-believers, and secretly wondering how to tap into the civic organizing power of faith-based institutions. But truth be told, from the perspective of progressives of color, faith-based institutions of color are steeped in social welfare and social justice, in K-12 access, in college access, in undocumented immigrant advocacy, in HIV/AIDS education, in job retraining, in prisoner reentry. These are all issues that are bedrock to communities of color. And if secular coalitions are going to remain white, primarily middle class to affluent, then they will go the same route of marginalization as the GOP is going. And so addressing these issues in her article, Next Wave, Atheist Leaders and White Privilege, Diane Ariano, who is an atheist and one of my mentees, and also the program coordinator of the Women's Leadership Project, which is a civic engagement, feminist, humanist mentoring program that I founded in South LA schools several years ago. Diane had this to say: over the past several years, we worked at schools where students who aren't considered gifted or, quote, college material aren't encouraged to prepare for college. For example, African-American students are disproportionately shut out of college prep, AP, and honors classes, advanced placement. And undocumented students are often told straight up by racist teachers that, quote, my taxes shouldn't pay for you to go to college. Black and Latino students are searched, profiled, and basically considered guilty until proven innocent. Girls of color are ritually silenced when it comes to speaking out about basic rights like freedom from sexual harassment or access to birth control. Most of our students come from highly religious backgrounds that discourage any form of questioning about gender roles. At 16 and 17, girls are already saddled with the double and triple burdens of schoolwork, housework, caregiving, and childcare for younger siblings. Being involved in the WOP, they begin to see the sexism and these double standards and the constant misogynist policing of their sexuality and the racist bitch, hoe, mammy, maid roles that society stereotypes them into. Hardly a week goes by when one of our girls isn't absent because she has to help with childcare or work to support her family. Hardly a quarter goes by when we don't hear a story about a pregnant 10th grader who is keeping her baby because she can't, quote, kill God's creation. For our girls, abortion is freedom and reproductive justice is life, period. So no, trying to get 10 Commandments displays taken down or challenging prayer in school are not our priorities as atheists and freethinkers of color in teaching in urban schools. So Diane's article highlights the intersectional realities of communities of color in this era in which people of color are more segregated than they were during the Brown v. Board era. And the reality is that the most segregated cities in the United States are not in the white supremacist Bible Belt, but they're in the more secular, more enlightened North. Cities like Newark, New Jersey, and Cleveland, Ohio, and Buffalo, New York, and Newark, New Jersey, again, sorry, and Los Angeles, California. And despite the high-octane racism, sexism, homophobia, and heterosexism of this past year's presidential shenanigans, some white atheists like to believe that they have privileged minority status, a la one reader that wrote in response to Diane's blog and had this to say: "It's just not true that being white is a salient feature of any atheist identity. Being an atheist in a very religious country pretty much crowds everything else out." And to circle back to an earlier theme in the talk, doesn't matter if you're atheist, Christian, Wiccan, Satanist, animist, as a person of color, in Christian fascist America, you are subject to a racist educational system that views you as a violent potential dropout, a racist criminal justice system that demonizes you as a crack-snorting, gang-banging, third striker, scourge, and a white supremacist media that systematically promotes and naturalizes white beauty ideals, white leadership, white moral authority, white romance, and white humanity as the universal norms. And so this paradox of worshiping what the Harlem Renaissance author Nella Larson termed the white man's God remains. Interviewed by the LA Times days before the election, an elderly African-American woman quipped, "I say I sleep with 3 men, God the Father, God the Son, and Barack Obama." And so her faith in this alpha male trinity is perhaps the ultimate challenge to free thought communities where storefront churches and prayer warriors run deep. It's a veiled lesson to all the humanist / non-believer organizations that are confused about how to approach social justice. So to paraphrase the old Civil War political cartoon slogan with the snakes cut up into pieces, it's time to diversify, coalition build, organize, or die. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for such a powerful and thought-provoking talk. I really appreciate it. The question I would have is, knowing that African Americans have taken religion and mixed it with sort of things that they brought over during the slave era, they've taken it and made it their own, and it has become a strong cultural identity for that community. How can we reach out to them without seeming as if we're trying to take away an important coping device with the ills that you've brought up that society has imposed on this community?
Well, I think it depends upon where you're coming from. So if you personally are engaged with one of the secular activist groups and you're in a diverse community, then you can reach out in terms of coalition building very specifically. Issues-oriented coalition building. So is there something happening with regard to, say, prisoner reentry, concerns? Is there something happening with regard to, education reform and the charterization and corporatization, of local public education? Are there things going down with regard to lack of access, to reproductive rights within your community, as far as clinics, not being available? I know that, Mississippi, for example, is in danger of having its final abortion clinic shut down. So I would say intersectionality in terms of coalition issues that are concrete, that are specific, that do not necessarily, encroach upon the belief systems of communities of color, but allow for opportunities to see that there is mutuality with regard to specific, politics, specific, community kinds of engagement. So it does not need to be this kind of, imperialist descending upon a community.
Hi, Dr. Hutchinson. Thank you so much for being here. I have a quick question. I was born and raised in the Mississippi Delta, and so I am wondering, I understand your experiences that you had on the West Coast and throughout the country, but I'm wondering if you could talk just briefly about any experiences you had in the South, particularly, and if you have family members who are Southerners, and how you even start a conversation with them. I know in my own family, you can't even have the conversation. There's no platform, there's no reception or no reciprocity for welcoming a discussion. And so I'm wondering if you could just tell us briefly any experiences you've had like that, particularly in the South as a person from Mississippi.
Yeah, actually, as with most African Americans, I have extended family from the South, but have not really been in the South in terms of any rich lived experience. But what I will say in terms of the more northern experience, obviously a more secular context, but still, very much steeped within an evangelical, Pentecostal, kind of dynamic, that it's important to begin the conversations with looking at the history of white supremacy in the United States as it pertains to secularism, not in a dogmatic way, but vis-a-vis freedom fighters that actually were secular of African descent, like A. Philip Randolph, like Nella Larson, like Zora Neale Hurston, like Langston Hughes, like James Baldwin, Richard Wright, and the list goes on. Very esteemed historical figures, that had a lot of ambivalence about the role of organized religion in the African American community and belief. Having those sort of conversations, talking about the Bible specifically and things that are deeply problematic in the literal text of the Bible with regard to hierarchies and humanization of women in particular. Maybe exposing, these relatives to, some of the more contemporary writings on the organizing that's being done around secularism and humanism within African American communities in the South. There are a number of, as you're probably aware, black freethinker organizations in the South. There's Black Nonbelievers of Atlanta. There's another group that I know of that's based in Florida. There's obviously the Dallas Coalition here, with Alex Jules in the corner there. So there are resources that are available in terms of just beginning the conversation and exposing, individuals that, are staunchly dogmatic and, staunchly hyper-religious. Greta.
I'll just yell something on the microphone. So you're talking about coalition building. My question is, do you think that existing groups and organizations that we might want to do, offer, new coalition to work with, do you think that they would be open to working with atheist groups and organizations? And what thoughts do you have on how to make that approach and how not to make that approach?
I think that it is very nascent because I know Black Skeptics Los Angeles is engaged in reaching out to faith-based organizations, specifically some of the Baptist churches, other churches that are gay-friendly but still have stigma, and apprehension about dealing with secularists and atheists. So, the issue is that it's going to take time. It's going to take some very focused events, for example. You know, we're having a dialogue on confronting homophobia in the Black church, you know, with gay-friendly, you know, faith-based organizations that also do HIV/AIDS, you know, prevention work. Do, you know, work with 20-something, you know, 30-something club boys, you know, do work, you know, with young people that are engaged in survival sex and trans communities. So the issue is that I think you have to be patient in terms of, you know, the tenor that you bring to it, but also, you know, try and be very specific and very tailored, you know, about what issues you want to partner, you know, with these communities with. Because what I've also found is that there is this tendency on the part, obviously, of the church community to try and, well, these people are reaching out because there's a deep need to be converted or reconverted. Okay? You've gotten a little of that sentiment. So you got to be wary of that aspect. But when dealing with nominally, you know, faith-based, and particularly in my example, you know, queer, same-gender loving organizations that are more the nuns, you know, the spiritualists that are constantly, you know, spouting God, but we don't subscribe to organized religion. You know, there's still that apprehension. So it's a slow process, you know, it requires, I think, reciprocity in terms of what do you ultimately want to get out of this? And, you know, how are you going to move forward if the ship, you know, collapses?
I was going to ask you, you kind of touched on that, my question. Coming from California, you do upcoming Proposition 8 being appealed. And if my reading was right as far as politics goes, the largest group opposing it were minorities.
I'm sorry, so the largest group
opposing? The largest groups that helped defeat or put Proposition 8 into effect turned into be minorities. But they were the ones that pushed it over the top. And I was wondering how, since you're from, I think you said from Los Angeles, kind of, if you would comment on the way that minority groups get to pick, I would say pick on, but become empowered enough to where they can find victims of their own. For instance, the gay community, where they can strip them of the rights to get married. And I just think that's an odd phenomenon that I'd like to hear your perspective on. People like Colin Powell, who, you know, was against repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell originally, but now I think he's for it. But it always struck me odd how minority communities seem to enjoy finding another minority to beat up on. And I was just wondering what your sense of that was in California, if that was true, that the Hispanic and Black community fought against you know, gay marriage in that respect.
Right, so it is true that there were a large number of African Americans and Latinos that were for Proposition 8. But what also came out after the election, and this was via a poll that was done by a Loyola Marymount University researcher, was that the numbers of African Americans that supposedly supported Proposition 8 were much lower than had originally been forecast. Okay, so it's not the fact that, you know, there was this groundswell, you know, of homophobic African Americans, you know, coming out in support for Proposition 8. That said, yes, 54% of African Americans did support Proposition 8. I'm not really sure, you know, what the number was within the Latino community. But with regard to this paradox of minorities, and I have problems with that term minorities because we are not minorities. Okay, minorities is, you know, a term that the dominant culture uses to, you know, dispossess, you know, mark and to marginalize. So with regard to this issue of the paradox, you know, of people of color opposing marriage equality and being homophobic and heterosexist, people of color are part and parcel of the dominant culture. The dominant, you know, white supremacist, heterosexist, patriarchal, masculinist dominant culture. And coming from, obviously, a hyper-religious tradition, you know, hyper-religious, you know, Western Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, you know, that endorses that, you know, that has that as the letter, you know, within the Bible. So there should not be any expectation, you know, that communities of color are going to be radically different in terms of these hierarchies of gender and sexuality. The other issue with regard to homophobia and heterosexism from an African American perspective, is that it's deeply tied to these questions of the racialization of gender and the way in which masculinity and femininity, have been constructed within a white supremacist prism, such that hypermasculinity is something that is privileged within certain segments of the African American community precisely because of this tier of white supremacist masculinist domination. So in terms of the schools that I work with, there is a lot of hypermasculinist swagger and posture that comes out as homophobic pushback, as heterosexist pushback. It's very frontal, very virulent, anti-gay pushback and harassment. But it needs to be viewed within that broader prism, insofar as African Americans have been dehumanized within a white supremacist context. And that is not to say that there's any purchase in terms of African American expressions of heterosexism and homophobia, but they are, in my view, different than white supremacist expressions of homophobia and heterosexism. And obviously, African Americans coming out in support of Proposition 8 is deeply problematic in terms of the lives and the dehumanization of gays within the black church. That's a really critical issue insofar as there are a lot of LGBT, queer, same gender-loving folk that are closeted within the church that do not have rights in terms of their families, being affirmed, that are becoming homeless as young people, that are resorting to survival sex in broader numbers, contracting HIV/AIDS in broader numbers. So this has had a ripple effect, this institutionalization of homophobia within the African American community. One more.
I think part of the problem is why people, if you ask most people, do they believe in the devil or something like that, they'll say no. I think the reason it's hard to get people to give up religion is because of the social aspect of it. Your churches fill in a big portion of a person's life. And even though they may have doubts and question a lot of things, I think it's hard for them to give up the social aspect, the community that is involved.
Yeah, I agree, and that was one of the leitmotifs of the talk, insofar as the black church has filled in these gaps that, but specifically with regard to the thesis of this talk, is that the fact that there is such, deeply ingrained residential segregation in the United States means that this is a predominantly white audience, that you are not going to have a critical mass of African American non-believers, because some of those African American non-believers are in the black church. They rely upon the black church in terms of networks, in terms of professional connections, in terms of all of the social welfare resources that are not being provided by the capitalist power structure, in terms of all of the issues that pertain to getting access to equitable housing and access to education and having some type of political capital. You cannot have a political convening in African American communities without the support of key and prominent black churches. That's just a reality. And like I said, that has a lot to do with the role of de facto segregation and 21st century apartheid in the United States. It's indelible.
All right, thank you very much.